The financial fall of Rome from gold to dust, long ago. Not in a time of kings and gods, but of ledgers and balance sheets. There existed a world that believed itself eternal. Before the dust settled over marble columns, and before history etched triumphs in stone, there was gold, and behind that gold, trust. The kind of trust that fuels empires, that fills treasuries, that convinces soldiers to fight and merchants to sail. Rome had that trust, once. But this is not the tale of emperors parading through arches or generals claiming victory in distant deserts. This is not about swords or sieges, not at first. This story begins quietly, with coins, with taxes, with decisions made in candlelit corridors of power, whispered policies, emergency decrees, and dreams of control. What happens when an empire forgets the value of its own currency? When gold turns to silver, and silver to copper, and finally, to dust. Tonight, we unravel a softer fall. A collapse you don't hear in a single crash, but in 1,000 small cracks. The financial fall of Rome. A story not carved by enemies, but corroded by its own ambition. So, take a breath. Dim the world around you. Let the lights grow low. And come with me. Not to the battlefield, but to the counting tables. Not to the throne, but to the treasury vault. And not to the moment Rome fell, but to the centuries it took to slip. Because sometimes the most powerful fall begins not with a bang, but with a budget. It began, as most things do in Rome, with a promise. A promise of greatness, of abundance, of control. Rome's wealth was not born in mines or markets. It was summoned into being by conquest. Every province brought plunder. Every enemy a treasury. The gold flooded in like spring rivers, and for a time there seemed no end. Gold coins, real gold, heavy and honest, poured into Roman hands. They called them aurai, minted with the faces of emperors, backed by military power and the illusion of permanence. And for a while, it worked. Trade flourished. Salaries were paid. Rome was, in every sense, golden. But gold, unlike ambition, is finite. Let us drift now to a room not of war, but of finance. It's the early days of the empire. The temples are clean. The forums still echo political debates. But deep beneath the Senate chambers, accountants are already uneasy. The costs of the empire are rising. Armies must be fed, clothed, and moved across continents. Roads must be maintained. Aqueducts repaired. Public games are staged. And emperors, they are expensive. What once was funded by conquest is now strained by peace. With fewer wars, there is less plunder. But Rome, proud, vast, and addicted to spectacle, cannot afford to shrink. So, it begins. Quietly, a new coin is issued, slightly lighter than the last, still golden, but not quite as pure. Fewer people notice at first, a grain of gold here, a fraction there. But the state notices. Its expenses now stretch a little, further. And in that convenience, a dangerous precedent is born. From here, the descent is slow and relentless. As the decades pass, emperors come and go, some wise, some mad, some both. But nearly all inherit the same problem: how to pay for power without raising revolt. The solution, again and again, is debasement. The solidus quietly replaces the aureus, and the silver denarius begins to lose its shine, not metaphorically, but literally. Each new version contains less silver than the previous one, replaced by base metals that corrode over time. The coins still bear imperial faces, but they no longer hold imperial value. A loaf of bread that once cost a coin now costs 5. And still, the state insists. It's fine. It's temporary. It's necessary. And what of the people? Imagine being a baker in Antioch, a blacksmith in Gaul, a soldier posted to the Rhine. One day you receive your pay in coins that feel lighter, duller. You squint. The emperor's face is there, yes. But the metal? It's not the same. You go to the market and find your coin buys less than it did last week. Inflation, devaluation. But they didn't use those words. They just felt it. Like a weight pressing down on their daily life. Slowly, quietly. They began to hoard, to barter, to distrust the very currency Rome minted in its own image. And that was the beginning of the unraveling. Now, let us step into the palace. Imagine a young emperor, barely 20, pacing beneath frescoed ceilings, advisors whispering urgently. The treasury is low. The provinces are restless. The army is unpaid. What can be done? Raise taxes? The people revolt. Cut spending? The elite protest. And so, once again, the mint is called upon. More coins are ordered. Less precious metal is used. New denominations are introduced to disguise the rot. Some emperors try to fix it. Aurelian reforms the coinage. Diocletian issues price edicts. Constantine introduces the solidus. One last gleaming effort to restore trust. But the damage is deep. A coin's value, after all, isn't just in its metal. It's in belief. And that belief is eroding. Let's drift even deeper now, into the lives of ordinary people. A farmer in Egypt no longer trusts the coins offered by Roman tax collectors. Instead, he hides grain in the floorboards and trades with neighbors directly. A merchant in Carthage begins demanding gold jewelry instead of currency. A soldier on the northern frontier accepts his pay, but trades it instantly for wine and blankets before its worth shrinks by morning. And beneath it all, the empire's roads, once bustling with trade, grow quieter. The markets shrink. The fountains run dry. Rome is still grand, still powerful, but the cracks are everywhere. And then comes the moment when it all becomes too much. Rome begins to tax not in money, but in goods. Citizens are required to pay in kind, in grain, in cloth, in labor. A subtle admission that the currency itself is no longer trusted. This is the final stage. Money still changes hands. Coins are still minted. But they are hollow, symbolic, almost ritualistic. The real economy has moved underground to barter, favors, and fear. Gold still exists, but it no longer flows through the hands of Rome's people. It rests in the vaults of the elite, in the temples of Constantinople, in the treasuries of new kings rising in the shadows. For everyone else, there is only copper and dust. So, what truly brought down the Roman economy? It was not one emperor nor one war, not one law or disaster. It was 100 small cuts, overspending, poor leadership, panicked reforms, and a refusal to face the truth. It was the lie that gold could be stretched, that value could be faked, that trust could be endlessly borrowed without ever being repaid. And when Rome's money failed, the empire followed. Because in the end, no matter how vast the walls or mighty the legions, no civilization survives once its people stop believing in its worth. And so tonight, as we lie beneath soft blankets, listening to history's long exhale, let us remember, the fall of Rome wasn't sudden. It was quiet, soft, like gold, turning to dust between trembling fingers. The sun had not yet risen when the empire first began to fracture. Not in the clash of armies or the burning of cities, not yet, but in the subtle, nearly imperceptible shifts that only accountants, merchants, and weary soldiers first noticed. It didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in silence, on ledgers, in small wooden stalls in faraway provinces, in a coin purse that suddenly weighed less than the week before. To understand the fall, we must first understand the illusion. Rome, in all its majesty, was built on a dream so bold it almost seemed divine, that one city could unite the known world. For centuries, that illusion was sustained by spectacle. Marble arches, thunderous games, armies in shining armor, and an endless procession of wealth from conquered lands. Gold flowed like water. Roads stretched like arteries through the body of the empire, pulsing with trade, taxation, and tribute. But beneath that polished surface, something fragile stirred. At the heart of Rome's power was its economy, not just its gold, but its promise. A coin, after all, is nothing but trust in metal form. And Rome's coins, stamped with the stoic faces of emperors, clad in laurels, carried the weight of an entire civilization's faith. This was not just currency, this was cohesion. The aureus, minted in high-quality gold, was more than a means of exchange. It was a symbol of order, of control, of permanence. In the far corners of the empire, in Britain's cold outposts, Egypt's deserts, and the bustling ports of Hispania, Roman coins spoke louder than decrees. They were Rome itself, held in the hand. But nothing born of men lasts forever. The world that Rome built, vast, dazzling, complex, began to cost more than even conquest could cover. The maintenance of the empire was more demanding than its expansion. Roads needed rebuilding, forts needed manning. Borders had to be held not by glory, but by salaries, by rations, by pensions. And the wars didn't stop. They simply changed. Gone were the grand campaigns of Julius Caesar, sweeping across Gaul. In their place came endless conflicts on the fringes, border skirmishes, internal rebellions, and raids from tribes who knew Rome was aging. These were wars that didn't enrich. They exhausted. So Rome, the empire of iron will and golden dreams, began to dig into its own pockets. And the treasury. It had limits. Imagine a Roman bureaucrat, cloaked not in armor, but in anxiety, standing before a table of wax tablets and papyrus scrolls, watching the columns no longer balance, expenses rising, revenues falling, trade routes disrupted, provinces producing less, armies are asking for more. There was no plunder to patch the hole this time, so they turned to the only tool that promised relief without revolt, the mint. The first coin debasements were barely noticeable. A touch less gold here, a bit more alloy there. The coins still bore the emperor's face, still shone if held in the right light. But the purity was gone, a hidden erosion beneath the gleam. The emperors knew this, but the people did not. Not yet. And as emperors changed, some assassinated, others merely replaced, the temptation grew stronger. Each ruler faced the same riddle: how to fund loyalty without fire, how to keep the legions fed, the streets calm, the senators silent. And the answer, again and again, was to promise more than the empire could afford. They minted hope, in copper, in silver, in whatever remained. The people began to feel it first in their markets, in the sudden hesitation of a baker counting out change, in the grumbled negotiations between farmers and tax collectors, in the slow realization that what once bought a meal now bought only flour. And yet, the imperial court, removed from these day-to-day worries, continued to operate with grandeur. Banquets, monuments, ceremonies, all funded by a currency that no longer held the weight it once did. And what of the army? The Roman legions, once the pride of the Republic and the backbone of the empire, now grew restless. Soldiers marched for years on unstable borders under commanders with political ambitions and little funding. When their pay arrived late, or worse, in coins that vendors no longer trusted, the soldiers did not simply grumble. They mutinied. They proclaimed their own generals as emperors. They marched not only against enemies, but against the capital itself. Money, once the invisible glue holding together the might of Rome, had become its poison. Let us now shift the scene, not to the palaces of Rome, but to the provinces, to the world that existed at the edges. There, the empire's economic collapse was not a debate. It was a daily crisis. In the marketplaces of North Africa, sellers began refusing certain coins. In Gaul, local economies reverted to barter, salt for wool, wine for grain. In the eastern provinces, wealthy merchants hoarded old coins, melting them into jewelry rather than risk accepting the state's diluted money. And the state, It began to demand taxes not in coin, but in kind. Wheat, cattle, cloth. The Roman government, once a marvel of monetary innovation, now functioned like a feudal lord. The word trust faded from daily life. Inflation soared, but the term hadn't yet been invented. Prices doubled, tripled, and rose without pattern. Sellers raised costs simply to stay ahead of the devaluation. Buyers hesitated, hoarded, resisted. And the empire's response? More coins, more decrees, more price controls. Laws were passed demanding fixed prices on goods, threatening punishment to anyone who disobeyed, as though value could be legislated by force. Merchants ignored them. Black markets flourished. Governors pleaded. Nothing worked. By the 3rd century, the denarius, once the standard silver coin of the empire, was a ghost of its former self. Its silver content, once nearly pure, had dropped to less than 2%. It tarnished in the palm. It was lighter, rougher, and everywhere worthless. Still, the emperors clung to the illusion. Still, they minted. Still, they promised. But the economy no longer listened. And beneath this crumbling structure, something else shifted. Something invisible, yet profound. The Roman people changed. They began to distrust the state, not just with their money, but with their lives. Civic pride withered, loyalty fractured. A society once built on participation, law, and shared prosperity became a society of retreat. The rich withdrew to their villas. The poor grew resentful. The middle, once Rome's strength, faded. The empire did not fall in a single day. It fell in confidence, coin by coin. As we rest here, listening to the echoes of forgotten mints and fading footfalls in imperial halls, we might ask, was this inevitable? Could an empire as vast and ambitious as Rome ever have avoided collapse? Perhaps. But perhaps, too, the answer lies in understanding what Rome tried to do and what it failed to see. Empires do not only die by war, sometimes they die by accounting, by assuming their power is eternal, by believing gold can be stretched, by thinking the people will always believe in the same promises. In that quiet, slow erosion, trust dies first, then currency, then everything else. And so, we find ourselves at the edge of an era. The stage is set. The coins are already rusting. The legions are unpaid. The people were disillusioned. What comes next is not just collapse. It is the price of forgetting that all power, even Rome's, rests on something more fragile than gold. It rests on belief. The rise. Let us begin not in collapse but in creation, in a time when Rome was not yet an empire, but an idea growing teeth. A republic carving its name into the world with roads, resolve, and something far more enduring than war. A system. The Roman economy was not born in opulence, but in necessity. The early republic did not conquer to boast. It conquered to feed, to fund, to build. Every grain shipment, every land survey, and every census served a single cause: stability. The strength of early Rome was its structure. It did not merely absorb new lands. It integrated them. Conquered provinces became arteries of wealth, flowing back to the heart of the republic, not just in treasure, but in taxes, trade, and tribute. Roman roads, laid stone by stone through forests and mountains, were not just military corridors. They were financial lifelines. Along them traveled caravans of goods, tax collectors, merchants, and messengers, the pulse of a living economic organism. The marketplace was the true temple of Rome. In every city and town, a forum stood as both a symbol and a system. Here, fishmongers stood beside philosophers. Olive sellers debated with architects. Wealth moved hand to hand in plain daylight. Coinage arrived as a revolution. No longer would men trade sacks of wheat for bolts of wool. Now there was the denarius, the sestertius, the as. Small discs of metal, minted with precision, became the shared language of exchange. These coins did not merely hold value, they defined it. The Republic standardized weight, design, and metal content, and in doing so, it achieved what even its armies could not: a single financial identity from Britannia to the Nile. Taxes were no longer arbitrary demands from the powerful. They were scheduled, assessed, and enforced through registries. Citizens, landowners, and subject cities were entered into rolls. The economy moved not on chaos, but on records. Public and private tax collectors working under state contracts became essential cogs in this machine. Their methods were not always gentle, but they ensured Rome's coffers remained full. And in return, Rome kept the peace. Rome's wealth grew not only by conquest, but by bureaucracy. Temples doubled as treasuries. State granaries monitored harvests. Prefects managed food supplies, shipping schedules, and grain distributions with eerie efficiency. As wealth gathered, Rome spent it not only on weapons, but on wonder. Aqueducts carried clean water into cities. Paved roads outlasted empires. Amphitheaters hosted not only games, but also public gatherings, civic investment in marble and mortar. The grain dole, subsidized food for citizens, was not simply generosity, it was insurance. By feeding the masses, Rome quelled the unrest. Hunger was dangerous, bread was power. The economy knew this before the emperors ever did. Trade routes stretched outward, linking Rome to every known corner of the earth. Silk from China, spices from India, glass from Syria, amber from the north, all passed through Roman hands. The empire was not just military, it was mercantile. Ports along the Mediterranean, Ostia, Alexandria, Carthage, buzzed with activity. Warehouses brimmed with exotic goods. Customs houses recorded imports and exports like sacred rites. The sea was not just water, it was wealth. And behind every shipment, every transaction, there stood the law. Rome's economic system was deeply legal. Contracts, loans, partnerships, all written, witnessed, enforced. Commerce was not chance. It was codified. Banking in Rome was rudimentary, yet far from primitive. Argentari, money handlers, offered loans, exchanged currencies, kept records, and even managed investments. Interest rates were calculated, and debts were pursued with vigor. Roman households, especially those of the upper classes, maintained account books. Slaves trained in numbers managed estates. Wealth was measured not only by land, but by liquidity. To be rich in Rome was to be organized. Senators were forbidden from engaging directly in commerce, but this was more performance than principle. They used freedmen, clients, and family members as fronts, ensuring their gold flowed into shipping, mining, and trade nonetheless. Even entertainment served the economy. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, theatrical plays, these were not just distractions. They were funded by politicians seeking favor, supported by taxes, and fed by a growing web of contracts and workers. Slavery, brutal and foundational, formed the backbone of economic production. In mines, on estates, in mills, in workshops, enslaved labor turned Roman ambition into output. Their suffering powered Rome's material success. But Rome was not blind to risk. Grain reserves were stockpiled, coin hoards were guarded, disaster relief was planned. The empire may have been brutal, but it was not unprepared. In the provinces, Roman economic influence reached deep. Local elites were offered roads, water, and trade in exchange for taxes and obedience. The empire built not just fortresses, but economies, each woven into the imperial fabric. Even language played a role. Latin became the tongue of contracts, law, and official accounts. Greek thrived in the East, but Rome's ledger was inscribed in Latin, and through it, the empire spoke profit. In the East, wealth was more abundant, older cities, richer traditions, deeper markets, and Rome drew from it all, borrowing systems, adapting currencies, absorbing merchant networks. It did not invent everything. It improved what it conquered. Gold, silver, and bronze coins moved through every class of society. From the hands of beggars to the coffers of governors, money became Rome's bloodstream. It flowed through temples, houses, streets, and shrines. The census, taken every 5 years, was more than a count. It was a financial blueprint. Who owed taxes? Who owned land? Who could be conscripted? This data allowed Rome to calculate and calibrate its economic reach. Rome's financial system was, in many ways, a mirror of its military. Disciplined, hierarchical, relentless. But where the army conquered with swords, the economy conquered with ledgers. The army itself was a massive financial undertaking. Soldiers were paid regularly, rewarded with pensions, and settled in colonies after service, a system that spread Roman culture and stabilized newly conquered regions. The currency itself was propaganda. Emperors stamped their victories on coins, reforms, alliances, even dreams of peace, all announced through engraved metal. Rome's economic language was minted in bronze and silver. And yet, despite its order, the economy remained flexible. When new provinces joined, tax systems adapted. When disasters struck, grain flowed from Egypt. Rome adjusted. It was not static. It was resilient. At its peak, the empire could move wealth from one end to the other in months. Caravans crossed deserts. Ships braved storms. Couriers galloped across bridges built by engineers long dead. Rome was old but alive. The financial brilliance of Rome was not in invention, but in integration. It took hundreds of systems, merged them into one, and bound them to its name. The empire became a marketplace that spoke in coin and contract. And yet, even now, faint cracks could be felt. Land concentration in elite hands, rural depopulation. Debts are mounting in poorer districts. The machine was humming. But strain had begun to settle beneath the surface. For generations, those cracks were managed. The economy had momentum. The state had reached. Rome had experience. It absorbed shocks, rebuilt roads, reformed taxes. And it told itself, this will always work. Perhaps this was the true rise, not just in wealth, but in confidence. In the unspoken belief that Rome had solved the riddle of power, that no storm could shake it, that coins would always bear the emperor's face, and that face would always mean value. Provinces flourished, cities expanded, the treasury gleamed, and for a time, the system worked. No empire before had balanced such vastness with such control. It was not perfect, but it endured. The Roman economy was not merely rich, it was rational, structured, predictable. It allowed the empire to manage crises, reward loyalty, and maintain influence across 3 continents. But empires are not eternal. And even the most elegant systems age. What rises, slowly, patiently, brilliantly, often does not fall with fire. It fades. First, in the margins, then in the center, not in a scream, but in a sigh. And so we end this chapter, not with collapse, but with caution. The machine still turns, the coins still gleam, but already something has shifted in the air, a faint whisper beneath the din of markets and games. Rome is rising still, but gravity waits. Peak, power and lifestyle. At the height of its glory, Rome no longer needed to declare its power. It radiated from every stone. The empire breathed in gold and exhaled order. Wealth was not simply measured, it was choreographed and folded into daily lifelike rituals. Coins didn't just buy goods, they bought time, status, and serenity. In every province, Rome's presence was felt in both coinage and comfort. The capital itself pulsed like a living treasury. Marble columns framed avenues filled with silk-robed citizens. Bronze statues gleamed in sunlit plazas, while fountains spilled water imported from hills far beyond the horizon. Rome had mastered not only its enemies but also the elements. It sculpted beauty from stone and made luxury feel inevitable. Even the air felt choreographed. Scents of cinnamon, myrrh, and roasted honey floated through courtyards where wind passed quietly over mosaics. Every villa became a poem of wealth, tiled with gods, softened by silks, lit by oil lamps of imported bronze. To live well was no longer ambition, it was expected. Among senators and equestrians, dinner was the theatre of dominance. Lavish feasts spilled into the night, peacocks served in gold, olives preserved in wine, courses timed by music and conversation. Servants rotated dishes without sound. The poor ate bread. The elite tasted the world. Wealth redefined silence. In Rome's grand homes, silence wasn't emptiness. It was control. The walls were thick enough to muffle arguments. Gardens were wide enough to drown worry in birdsong. Time slowed where wealth pooled. And those who lived within it no longer knew hardship by name. Urban elites walked in tunics dyed in impossible colors. Purples forbidden to commoners. Threads laced with gold. Jewelry no longer spoke of vanity, but lineage. Amulets to gods, heirlooms of generals, worn not for beauty, but authority. The body became an extension of the treasury. Baths were not merely for cleanliness. They were temples of wellness, social contracts soaked in warm water. Senators discussed trade between steams. Poets recited verses while oil was poured over their backs. The empire's decisions often began in silence, interrupted only by splashing. And while the rich bathed in imported oils, the middle class sought their own version of grandeur. Modest homes with painted walls, balconies with potted herbs, and glass cups saved for feast days. A Roman of average means still felt the glow of empire through small comforts. Markets in Rome were scenes of symphonic chaos, voices, coins, spices, promises. Merchants offered glass from Syria, perfumes from Arabia, and rugs from the East. The currency tied it all together. Not merely a symbol of value, but of reach. A Roman coin could buy bread in Gaul or silk in Antioch. Every city mirrored the capital. In distant provinces, colonists built little Romes, temples, baths, courts, and theatres carved from stone and hope. The empire didn't just conquer land, it replicated itself within it. Wealth flowed outward, and in return, loyalty flowed back. The countryside fed the cities with quiet, precision. Olive orchards, vineyards, and grain fields stretched across Italy and beyond. Estates managed by literate slaves produced more than food. They produced legacy. A landowner's wealth was measured in miles, not meals. Wealth was generational. Sons were groomed not just for duty, but for inheritance. Education, arranged marriage, property. These were tools of preservation. A family's fortune was not to be enjoyed but multiplied. Luxury had its rituals, and so did longevity. Art flourished where stability held firm. Sculptors carved patrons into gods, painters turned walls into gardens, and poets sold verses like contracts. Patronage tied beauty to power. To fund an artist was to leave a whisper of your name in time. Religion too became intertwined with wealth. Temples gleamed with donations from generals, merchants, and magistrates. Sacrifices were weighed in silver. Ceremonies became displays of civic generosity. To be devout was to be public and costly. Even the dead were buried in style. Mausoleums rose along sacred roads, carved with names, virtues, and visions of paradise. Funeral feasts honored ancestors but also declared wealth. Death did not end status, it crystallized it. The calendar itself reflected abundance. Festivals dotted every month. Saturnalia, Lupercalia, games for emperors, tributes to gods. Markets closed, gifts were exchanged. Bread and spectacle blurred into a ritual. Rome celebrated itself as often as it ruled. The grain dole continued to grow. It fed the urban poor and secured their quiet. For many, free food was not shameful. It was Roman. It proved the system worked, that the city could be loud, wild, and still fed. Architects dreamed not of shelter, but of permanence. Concrete domes, vaults, aqueducts, built to outlive the men who ordered them. Structures became statements, temples to Jupiter, amphitheatres in stone, proof that Rome was made not only to conquer but to remain. Bridges connected more than rivers. They connected provinces to each other, towns to cities, markets to ports. They whispered the same message. Rome is near. Even at the edge of the world, a Roman citizen walked on Roman stone. Roads shimmered with the weight of trade. Soldiers, messengers, merchants, all moved on the same stones, laid by hands long buried. Along the Via Appia, the economy flowed like blood through a vein. To walk a Roman road was to walk within the system. Time, too, was measured in coins. Labourers were paid by the day, lawyers by the case, priests by the rite. Coins clinked in temples, baths, brothels, and schools. The empire had found a way to turn time into currency, and all obeyed. Libraries held more than scrolls, they held Rome's intellect. Scholars preserved Greek thought, expanded Roman law, mapped stars, and debated gods. Knowledge was a commodity, but also a currency. To think well was to serve Rome. The army, vast and professional, was its own economy. Soldiers were paid, housed, clothed, and upon retirement, rewarded. They became landowners, mayors, and merchants. Military service did not end at the border. It continued in the bank. Festivals honoring military victories became civic rituals. Gold statues were paraded, coins minted, and prisoners displayed. The glory of conquest was etched into the walls and wallets of the empire. Prosperity was a performance. The imperial treasury swelled with tribute. Governors sent gold, grain, and gems. Emperors reviewed accounts like priests reviewing omens. Balance, order, control. The numbers mattered because they predicted rebellion before it began. Bureaucracy expanded alongside wealth. Tax collectors, record keepers, legal scribes, all formed a silent army, managing the numbers behind the marble. The empire ran on ink and stone, as much as on blood and iron. Women of the upper classes moved through salons, libraries, and dining halls, not as decorations, but as decision-makers. They inherited land, hosted diplomats, managed dowries, and funded temples. The influence did not always wear armor. In the outer provinces, local elites mirrored Rome's nobility. They dressed like Romans, wrote in Latin, and built with Roman blueprints. The empire taught them how to rule, and in return, they upheld its presence with eager imitation. Luxury reached even into sleep. Mattresses of imported wool, linens scented with myrtle, walls painted in dreams. For the wealthy, rest was not an end to the day. It was a continuation of ease. The night had its own currency. Even pets became reflections of wealth. Monkeys in golden collars, peacocks in tiled courtyards, dogs fed better than farmers. Status extended into the absurd. Possession became a performance, and no creature was too small for symbolism. Wine was the great equalizer. The poor drank it watered, the rich with honey and spice. To pour wine was to participate in Rome itself. In villas and taverns, every cup carried centuries of civilization. In the theatres, tragedy and comedy flickered across candlelit stages. The actors wore masks. The audience wore approval. Tickets were free and paid for by politicians seeking popularity. Performance became policy. Bureaucrats counted not just money but people. Census takers walked dusty roads, recording names, lands, and taxes owed. Every citizen was data, measured, stored, and calculated into Rome's balance sheets. Gold reserves were hoarded in underground vaults, guarded not only by soldiers but by ritual. Access was rare. Accounts were kept in wax, then stone, then law. The treasury itself became a sacred place, quiet, vast, untouchable. The sea belonged to Rome. Its navy patrolled the waters. Its merchants ruled the ports. Trade routes shimmered like threads tying the continents together. Fish from the Atlantic, grain from Egypt, incense from India, all flowed inward. Foreign ambassadors arrived draped in silk and suspicion, bearing tribute and seeking favor. The court responded with feasts, alliances, and well-timed gifts. Diplomacy became an extension of the economy, a game played with fine wine and heavy purses. The city never slept entirely. Torchbearers lit alleyways, guards walked colonnades, and distant music drifted from open windows. Even in darkness, coins changed hands. Rome's heartbeat echoed softly through every hour. Not everyone lived in splendor, but even the poor, even the laborers and orphans, felt the reach of the system. They walked on Roman streets, drank Roman water, watched Roman parades. The empire was not equal, but it was everywhere. The citizens did not question their place. They paid taxes, followed festivals, and obeyed the coin. In return, they received peace, bread, and belonging. It was not just wealth that defined Rome, it was its rhythm. And in that rhythm, Rome felt eternal. The arches would always stand. The coins would always hold weight. The empire had mastered not only power, but permanence. But beneath the marble, something quiet had already begun to change. Before we move on to the next chapter, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these videos that calm your soul. Conflict, collapse, or corruption. It didn't begin with armies crossing borders or thrones crumbling overnight. It began with hesitation. A merchant unsure if the coin he received was still worth what it used to be. A farmer weighing grain more carefully than before. The empire looked the same on the surface, but within, the rhythm had begun to slow. Rome was not falling, not yet. But the gears were grinding unevenly, as if time itself had caught a fever. The early signs of imbalance were too subtle for those in palaces to feel. Grain shipments that once arrived on time now lagged behind schedule. Public fountains began to run dry in cities that once glittered with flowing water. Soldiers who had marched for years were handed wages that couldn't fill their stomachs. And in the markets, coins passed hand to hand more nervously. Value was still written on metal, but trust was evaporating. The Roman machine had grown too vast, too complex, too confident. The very size that had once made Rome unstoppable now made it vulnerable. Problems spread faster than solutions. A missed delivery in one province created a hunger in another. A corrupt official in one city echoed the consequences in 5 more. The economy didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled, strand by strand, like silk soaked in water. With conquest slowing, the wealth that once poured into Rome like floodwater became a trickle. Provinces that had once funded lavish games and legions now demanded defense and aid. The empire had shifted from collecting tribute to patching wounds. Yet the expenses remained imperial. The state was bleeding coin in every direction, and there was no more gold to squeeze from its borders. To fill the growing gap, the state turned to its mints. Coinage was diluted, first cautiously, then carelessly. Silver was thinned with bronze. Gold coins became lighter and thinner. The images of emperors still shone on their faces, but the substance behind them faded. Inflation arrived quietly at first, like fog. By the time it was recognized, it had already taken root. In markets, bread prices doubled. Meat vanished from common stalls. Fishermen asked for payment in grain instead of coin. Sellers no longer trusted currency to hold its worth between dawn and dusk. The emperor could declare value, but the people could feel weight, and the weight was no longer on the side of Rome's coin. Rome responded the only way it knew how, by printing more money. Decrees were issued, coins stamped, and slogans proclaimed. But each new coin entered a world less willing to believe. The more the state printed, the more the people clutched what little they trusted. Land, tools, dried fruit, old silver. A nation flooded with money had never felt so poor. To counter rising costs, the empire issued maximum price laws. Merchants were ordered not to raise prices under threat of punishment. But fear does not produce wheat. The economy slipped underground. Barter reappeared, not by preference, but out of survival. In alleyways and back rooms, new systems bloomed as the old ones decayed. Tax collection, once systematic, became chaotic. With coins holding little value, taxes were demanded in kind: grain, livestock, cloth. Some communities complied, others resisted. Rebellions sparked not from politics, but from pressure. People were not protesting Rome's ideals, they were fleeing its appetite. In the provinces, the presence of Rome grew thinner. Governors held their titles, but power faded. Troops were fewer. Roads went unrepaired. Local strongmen rose in the silence. They promised security where Rome had become a rumor. Loyalty became conditional and sometimes negotiable. Corruption, once a shadow in the system, now stepped into the light. Tax agents took bribes to erase records. Judges sold verdicts. Provincial commanders auctioned safety. The state, desperate to function, looked away. Morality didn't vanish. It was traded for momentum. And in this shifting world, the Roman soldier changed too. No longer the disciplined symbol of the empire, he became a survivor. Underpaid and overworked, he accepted side deals, looted towns he was meant to protect, and sometimes switched sides entirely. Rome's enemies didn't need to outfight her. They needed only to wait. Emperors cycled through the throne-like seasons, some assassinated, others exiled, all inheriting a mess. Every new regime promised recovery. Reforms were announced with the ceremony. New currencies were minted. But the cracks beneath the surface ran deeper than any proclamation. Some rulers meant well. They tried to restore coin purity, streamline taxes, and fund infrastructure. But no one ruled in a vacuum. The machine had already rotted inside. Every reform encountered resistance. Every change sparked unrest. Even wise leadership couldn't fix a body already failing at the bones. Rome's elite sensed the shift. They began to withdraw, not from Rome itself, but from responsibility. They closed their estates, tightened their networks, and surrounded themselves with guards. The state could crumble, but their villas would stand, or so they believed. The divide between rich and poor became canyon deep. The wealthy still dined on imported figs and honey-glazed boar. The poor queued for bread or starved quietly in alleys. Social mobility, once possible, became a myth. Coins traveled only in circles, from merchant to noble and back again. Rural life, once productive, turned desperate. The land was abandoned, and fields were left to weeds. Peasants tied themselves to wealthy landowners in exchange for protection. A grim preview of feudalism. The empire remained in name, but the republic's dreams had vanished. Rome, built on cities, began to shrink from them. Urban centers emptied, entertainment ceased, baths closed, theaters fell silent. Wealth was no longer visible, it was hidden, hoarded, buried. And culture, starved of stability, began to retreat into echo. The borders, once proudly defended, became bleeding edges. Tribes pressed in not as invaders, but as consequences. Some came seeking land, others fleeing hunger. Rome fought back, but often through treaties and bribes. Its armies, stretched and underpaid, became shadows of former glory. These foreign groups, Goths, Vandals, Franks, weren't outsiders anymore. They settled within Rome's frame, hired into Roman armies, taxed and titled. Rome no longer controlled the frontier. It negotiated it, sometimes hour by hour. Power lost clarity. Where once it came from the Senate, the emperor, and the law, now it came from whoever had control of food, soldiers, or land. Cities once led by civic-minded councils now bowed to local warlords. Law became localized, flexible, and often for sale. Infrastructure fell into disrepair, roads turned to rubble, aqueducts dried, granaries rotted. What had taken centuries to build disappeared in decades of neglect. Rome had once engineered the world. Now, even its tools betrayed it. Trade, too, declined. Piracy returned. Merchant fleets hesitated, ports emptied. The Mediterranean, once Rome's highway, grew quiet. Goods became rare. What had once been bought with the coin now came only through favors or violence. Communication suffered. Couriers were delayed, and roads were dangerous. Messages went missing. Edicts arrived too late. The state became blind in its own corridors. Coordination collapsed. The empire became a collection of disconnected echoes. And amid this confusion, the people adapted. They turned to the church, to local guilds, to family networks. Loyalty to Rome faded. Belief shifted. The community no longer meant citizenship. It meant survival. Christianity, once persecuted, now rose with certainty. Churches replaced temples. Bishops replaced governors. Spiritual authority outlasted economic chaos. In a world where coin lost meaning, faith became the new currency of hope. The imperial court moved east toward Constantinople, away from the fires flickering in the west. There, the empire lingered longer, buffered by wealth and guarded by strategy. But even there, the symptoms had arrived. The collapse didn't follow borders, it followed behavior. Desperation led to dangerous choices. Rome hired entire foreign armies to defend it. Mercenaries protected cities from other mercenaries. Allegiances changed by the week. Rome was still defended, just no longer by Romans. Education eroded. Schools lost funding. Scholars were exiled or forgotten. Books were no longer copied. Libraries burned or crumbled. The mind of Rome, once sharp, dulled into superstition and memory. The very identity of Rome began to blur. What did it mean to be Roman when the roads no longer worked, the laws no longer held, and the currency no longer bought belief? Citizenship had once been the highest honor. Now, it was a burden or a myth. Some held on to hope. They repaired bridges, reopened schools, and argued in Senate halls. But theirs was a dying light, noble but dimming. The engine they tried to revive no longer responded to the effort, only to inertia. Rome didn't fall. It simply failed to rise again. The systems that once lifted it became the chains that dragged it downward. The structure that had brought order now guaranteed collapse. By the time enemies breached the walls, there was little left to conquer. Rome had already emptied its meaning. The coins scattered across the ground told stories, not of power, but of what had been. The citizens, weary and broken, did not scream when the banners changed. They had already lost more than politics. They had lost rhythm, purpose, and the trust that had once passed silently through hands in the form of a coin. Gold, still gleaming, was hoarded or hidden. No longer a tool, now a relic. It could not repair what was gone. Rome had been rich, but richness had not been enough. In the ruins, some remembered the old ways, the law, the order, the honor. They whispered Latin verses beneath broken arches. But memory is not structure. It cannot hold weight. It can only echo. In the East, Rome endured, transformed, translated, renamed. But the spirit of the West had slipped away unceremoniously, not with conquest, but with corrosion. Gold turned to dust. Belief turned to distance. Some blamed emperors, others blamed the people. But in truth, Rome fell the way all great things fall, by forgetting why they stood by stretching too far and building too wide without looking down. The empire had become too clever to be honest, too vast to be vigilant, too wealthy to be wise. And when it needed courage, it printed more coins. When it needed unity, it offered more laws. When it needed trust, it was already too late. So, the fall was not a moment. It was a mood, a century-long sigh, a soft fading of brilliance into shadow. The empire dimmed not because it lost battles, but because it lost balance. By the time Rome's enemies crossed its borders, the empire had already emptied itself of resistance, not through cowardice, but through exhaustion. It had spent centuries feeding a system it no longer understood. Even its victories felt hollow, purchased with promises no one intended to keep. The people who once called themselves Roman now whispered other names: tribal, local, spiritual. Allegiance, once a unifying thread, unraveled into fragments of necessity. Where the state had disappeared, they created smaller worlds, ones they could still touch, trust, and survive within. Some cities fortified, others surrendered. Some citizens fled into the countryside, others stayed and adapted. The dream of Rome no longer held them. What mattered was grain, safety, and shelter. Ideals faded beneath the daily need for bread. There were still coins, shrines, and scrolls bearing the name of the empire. But these were echoes, relics of a system that had relied too long on image over substance. Rome's greatness had not been stolen. It had been spent. In the darkened halls of forgotten palaces, a few still read laws by candlelight and still wrote reports to emperors who no longer listened. They spoke Latin to empty rooms, keeping time by a calendar the world no longer followed. And yet, not everything vanished. Roads remained, even if broken. Ideas survived, passed in monasteries, and whispered in prayer. The empire may have collapsed as an economy, but as an influence, it began a second life. The gold Rome, once used to bribe peace, now lay hidden in ruins, melted into new kingdoms, and reforged into foreign crowns. Its value never left the world. Only its symbol changed. Rome's treasure outlived its trust. In time, new empires would rise, claiming Rome's legacy as their own. But none could fully rebuild the web that once stretched from desert to glacier. Rome had been an experiment in scale, and it had taught the world both how to build and how to break. The story of Rome's collapse isn't one of destruction, but of disconnection. Systems failed not because they weren't brilliant, but because they lost the thread between the coin, the citizen, and the state. Once that thread snapped, no wealth could tie it back together. So let us remember, what falls is not always crushed. Sometimes it settles into soil, and from the dust of lost coins and broken columns, new stories grow. Rome's collapse was not an end, but a long, quiet beginning of the world we now live in. Final echoes, the legacy of lost wealth. Long after the empire's borders faded and its banners were pulled down, the question lingered. What did Rome leave behind? Not just in stone or scroll, but in systems, in habits, in quiet ideas that outlived the coins that once bore the emperor's name. Rome may have forgotten its balance sheets, but the world did not forget Rome. Its ruins stood like unfinished sentences, waiting to be read. Marble temples with missing roofs, roads cracked but still walkable. Aqueducts are dry, yet pointing toward a genius that once knew how to move mountains. The economy had vanished, but its imprint was deep, like a shadow that refuses to fade even at nightfall. For generations, survivors scavenged what they could. Broken tiles became rooftops, abandoned estates became villages, even rusted coins were melted into tools. The empire had collapsed, but its pieces were repurposed. Rome's fall seeded new worlds, quietly, almost reluctantly. Roman law, once a financial framework, remained tucked inside monastery walls and fading legal scrolls. Monks who could barely afford candles copied texts about property rights, contracts, and taxation. These weren't just memories. They were blueprints waiting for revival. As medieval kingdoms rose, they did so under the long shadow of Roman economics. The notion that land could be measured, taxed, or titled, that came from Rome. So did the idea of civic obligation, public infrastructure, and centralized revenue. The empire was gone, but the ghost of its accounting still lingered. Coins reappeared centuries later, bearing the faces of new kings. But their circular shapes, their metal codes, their official weights, all followed Rome's lead. Even in forgetting, humanity remembered. Currency had become civilization's fingerprint, and Rome had pressed it first. Banking, long dormant, crept back into the world through the cracks left by Rome. Lending, borrowing, and risk, ideas once practiced in Roman fora, re-emerged in trading ports and merchant cities. Rome had made money a system. The world now tried to rebuild that system from dust. The concept of public funding, that taxes support the state and the state supports the people, never fully disappeared. Though abused and twisted through time, this idea originated in Rome. For all its failures, it had taught one great lesson, that power needs a ledger. The ruins themselves became teachers. Travelers walked ancient roads, not just to marvel, but to learn. Scholars studied collapsed aqueducts and tried to rebuild water systems. Economists, centuries later, pondered why Rome fell, and how money once moved across an empire without internet, banks, or machines. Even religion inherited Rome's model. The church, rising from the vacuum left behind, structured itself with eerie familiarity. Bishops as governors, tithes as taxes, Latin as the legal tongue of doctrine. Rome's framework became heaven's template. In many ways, the fall of Rome reshaped the world more profoundly than its rise. When the empire stood, it was admired. When it fell, it was dissected. Every collapse became a reference to Rome. Every new empire styled itself as a successor, not to its glory, but to its lessons. Economists now study Roman inflation like a prophecy. They note the coin debasement, the over-reliance on military funding, and the growing gap between rich and poor. They read the signs in ancient Latin as if trying to prevent history from whispering the same story twice. In university halls, students read of Diocletian's failed price edict, of Nero's vanity spending, of tax burdens too heavy for farmers to bear. These are not just facts. They are warnings stitched into time by an empire that tried to spend more than it could sustain. Landowners, even in today's world, owe something to Rome. The idea that land is power, that territory should be mapped, titled, and taxed. Rome carved that logic into clay before modern maps even existed. Its legacy lives under our feet, silent but sovereign. And in every capital city, where statues rise and domes are shaped, we see the faint outline of Roman economics. Central planning, civil services, military pensions, even bureaucracy itself, hated and yet indispensable, found its first permanent home in Rome. The roads, still visible in satellite images, are not just monuments, they are veins of memory. Some highways still follow Roman routes. Some cities still sit where Rome once placed them, geography shaped by tax routes, infrastructure born of empire. The very idea of citizenship, tied to legal rights and responsibilities, was Rome's economic invention. Before that, identity was tribal or religious. Rome tied it to taxes, service, and law. A citizen was counted because a citizen mattered, on paper, in coin, in court, and yet the empire's greatest failure remains its most sobering legacy. Rome forgot that wealth without balance breeds collapse. That system cannot run on fear forever. That money, when severed from meaning, becomes noise. These truths outlasted the empire itself. Historians still debate what Rome's economy might have become if stabilized. A pre-modern banking powerhouse, a federal superstate. But history doesn't play with what-ifs. It tells what was and warns what might be again. When Rome fell, it didn't just leave behind ruins. It left a mirror for every society since that mirror waits. It doesn't accuse, but it reflects. When debt grows unchecked, when inequality yawns wide, when systems overcomplicate, Rome's ghost whispers gently. I've seen this before. Roman values like civic duty and public investment have re-emerged in republics centuries later, not as imitation, but as rediscovery. The wheel was not reinvented. It was remembered. Rome had spun it first, then lost control. Great minds from Machiavelli to Gibbon stared into the ashes of Roman finance, trying to pull meaning from patterns. Some saw it as a warning, others as a puzzle. All agreed, Rome didn't fall in vain. It fell in view. Artists painted fallen columns not just for beauty, but as metaphors. Poets turned broken coins into symbols of lost trust. Rome's economy, in death, became mythology. It was no longer a marketplace. It was a message. The architecture of taxation survived even in kingdoms that despised Rome. Lords counted heads, weighed grain, and issued demands. They didn't know the formula came from a forgotten empire, but their scribes were copying from scrolls Rome left behind. Latin, the language of law and ledgers, echoed even where Roman power had vanished. In contracts, decrees, and legal codes. The syntax of the economy outlived the voice of emperors. Rome had vanished from the map, but it remained in the margins. In the East, where Constantinople stood strong, Roman financial thinking lived on for centuries. The Byzantine system refined taxation, refined the solidus coin, and created new economic protocols. But even there, Rome's seeds bore both brilliance and burden. The Byzantines didn't see themselves as something new. They called themselves Romans. In their taxes, trade routes, and court rituals, they carried the echo of Western collapse as both memory and caution. When Islamic scholars preserved Greek and Roman texts, they also preserved Roman economics. In Baghdad's libraries, scrolls of Roman trade policies and tax law were studied and stored. Rome's knowledge moved, even when its armies no longer could. Medieval Europe, starved of structure, often looked back to Rome not with nostalgia, but hunger. The dream of order, of law, of fair coin. It haunted kings and scribes alike. They didn't want the empire back. They wanted its efficiency. Centuries passed, yet Roman coins were still discovered in fields, in rivers, and in tombs. Their weight may have faded, but their message remained. I once held value. I once shaped lives. In that silence, they still speak. Rome's fall is studied not only in history, but in economics, sociology, and politics. It's a case study of how wealth can blind, how strength, when stretched thin, becomes fragility. Rome didn't lose a war. It lost its grip on truth. Modern central banks, obsessed with inflation targets, often cite Roman mistakes, debasement, overminting, price controls. It's strange but real. Decisions made 2,000 years ago still shape how we define value today. The idea that a currency must be backed by belief came from Rome's failure. No matter the metal, no matter the stamp, if the people stop trusting the coin, it turns to dust. That's not economics, that's emotion. And belief, not gold, is what builds civilizations. Rome had gold, and it lost it. But it also had belief, and when that eroded, the empire followed. The real currency wasn't metal. It was trust shared silently by millions. Rome taught the world how to build an economy. It also taught the world how to lose one. That legacy cannot be divided. It must be held whole. In wonder, in warning, in reverence for what once was, and what must not return. The legacy of Rome was not stored in its vaults or palaces, but in the tension between structure and fragility. It had engineered the world to serve its needs, and then forgot to preserve the spirit behind that system. Cities were built like clockwork, but the people inside them lost faith in the ticking. In time, that disconnect became louder than the coin, more powerful than any decree. Civilization doesn't collapse when the roads crumble. It collapses when the people stop walking them with purpose. Scholars who unearthed Roman ruins centuries later did more than dust off the stone. They revived the world beneath it. In the curvature of aqueducts and in the span of bridges, they traced the ambition of a people who once thought they could outlast time. But it wasn't the structures alone that fascinated me. It was the economy beneath them. How had money moved through these streets? What invisible force once linked the farmer to the palace? Rome had vanished, but its question still lingered in every footprint. The deeper legacy wasn't what Rome built, but what it revealed about building. That prosperity, when unguarded, will eat itself, that a system without reform will rot in silence. If wealth concentrates too tightly, the empire it supports will crack from within. These truths were not spoken by senators or poets. They were learned in collapse. And because they were learned that way, they were etched deeper into memory than any law. Modern societies still carry pieces of Rome inside them, often unknowingly, in the way we tax income, in how we fund armies, in how we debate public spending, pensions, and inflation. Rome left behind no perfect models, only unfinished ones. Every new government inherits that haunting blueprint, the layout of a city that rose on logic fell by greed and survives now as a warning beneath our skylines. Some still imagine Rome as a museum, a place of marble, armor, and myth. But it is true, ghosts do not haunt statues. It lives in spreadsheets, in national debts, in collapsing bridges and underfunded schools. It breathes in economic choices made without conscience and in systems so big they forget to ask if they still serve the people beneath them. Rome doesn't need resurrection. It needs remembrance, as a mirror, not a monument. When you hold a coin today, smooth and small, you are holding Rome's afterimage. Not because the coin is ancient, but because the idea is. That metal can carry faith. That currency can bind strangers into a society. The weight may have changed, and the face on its surface may be different, but the principle remains. Rome taught the world to believe in coins. And then it taught us what happens when that belief fades into fear. There is irony in how empires forget. Rome, once obsessed with record-keeping, lost track of itself in its final centuries. Temples were overgrown before the last tax assessments were updated. Mints kept printing while markets dried up. Bureaucrats followed rules that no longer matched reality. It wasn't that they didn't know. It was that they knew and still hoped the system would fix itself. That hope proved heavier than any coin. Some say Rome didn't fall. It transformed into kingdoms, into churches, into the distant silhouette of Europe itself. But transformation without truth is just decay under a new name. What made Rome fall wasn't just outside pressure. It was the internal refusal to adapt, the refusal to question its own momentum, the refusal to value people as much as a coin. The legacy of that refusal stretches further than the empire ever did, and yet not everything Rome left behind should be feared. Its vision of a connected world, of public goods, of citizenship based on service, those ideals still flicker beneath modern policy. The problem wasn't that Rome dreamed too big, it's that it stopped dreaming responsibly. Vision without accountability is dangerous. Rome proved that in bronze and blood, in wheat and whispers. We often look at history as a chain of events, wars, laws, rulers, but economies tell a quieter story. One of the decisions made in ledgers, in weighing scales, is what isn't bought as much as what is. Rome's financial story is not about collapse, it's about consequence. Each choice echoed, each inflation warped lives. Money isn't just math. Its memory, policy, and power are all hidden in plain sight. Rome didn't invent corruption, but it showed how corruption normalized becomes policy. When bribes become budgets, when theft becomes taxation, and when fraud is framed as flexibility, the system itself begins to forget what honesty looks like. It was not one emperor that brought ruin, but 1,000 quiet permissions. It's not a conspiracy, but a culture of convenience over courage. And perhaps that is the most haunting echo. How easily people accept decline when it arrives slowly. Rome did not fall in protest. It fell in fatigue, in resignation, in the quiet shrug of a shopkeeper accepting worthless coin. The silence was louder than rebellion. It was surrender to the inevitable, made one purchase at a time. The lessons are not lost, only often ignored. Every currency we use, every budget we debate, Every fiscal promise we believe carries Rome in its shadow. It is not about fearing collapse, but understanding how close we can come to it without ever realizing it. Rome's fall was not a mistake. It was a mirror placed in front of ambition without reflection. So when we build nations, when we plan economies, we must remember not just how Rome rose, but how it unraveled. The question is not whether greatness can be achieved. It's whether it can be sustained without forgetting who it serves. Rome served itself in the end. That is what doomed it. Not enemies, not war, but self-importance without self-awareness. And now, as the dust of history settles, and Rome rests beneath centuries of soil and study, its richest legacy remains not in treasure, but in truth. That money without meaning fails. That empire without balance broke. That trust, once broken, rarely returns unchanged. Rome didn't vanish, it became a warning, and the world, if it listens closely, may still hear the echo of a coin falling into silence. Modern connections. Today, when we tap a card at a terminal or transfer money with a click, we imagine we're far from the past. But behind each transaction is a structure older than the code that powers it. The idea of standardizing value, linking people through systems of exchange, and trusting institutions to hold it all together, came not from silicon, but from stone. Rome built this pattern first. We've just added screens. The empire of roads and legions once ruled with coins stamped in gold. Now, we rule with digits on glass, but the principle is identical. Belief sustains the system. When the Roman denarius lost its purity, people stopped trading with it. When our financial systems lose credibility, markets tremble, not because of war, but because of doubt. Central banks today echo ancient mints. Their policies are delivered not by imperial edict, but by press conferences and interest rates. Still, the goal remains the same: preserve stability through control of money. When Rome lost that control, inflation swept across provinces. And today, when we lose it, headlines follow. Different fonts, the same fear. Modern states borrow beyond their means, deferring repayment into the future. Rome once did the same, paying armies with promises, minting coins that shrank in worth, and building confidence with illusion. The illusion held until it didn't. It is the same line we now walk, quietly hoping faith will remain stronger than the weight of our spending. In Rome, the state grew so large that its systems buckled under their own weight. Citizens were taxed into silence, and bureaucracy tangled like vines. Today, we manage larger populations, broader budgets, and deeper data. Yet the fragility lingers beneath the surface. Complexity, when unchecked, stops serving people and starts serving itself. Consider the modern obsession with surveillance and compliance. Rome had scribes, we have servers. Both aim to keep track of the people and their dues. In both worlds, power fears invisibility. When systems don't see you, they fear losing you. The modern tax code may be digital, but its roots still grow in Rome's ledgers. Rome built its authority on standardization, a universal currency, shared laws, and common roads. Today, globalization mirrors that. One trade language, international banking rules, and central institutions spanning continents. The scale is different. The instinct is identical. Unify, organize, expand, then try not to break. Public infrastructure today carries Rome's signature. The idea that roads, water systems, and bridges should be state-funded is ancient. So is the problem of maintenance. When funding dries up, structures decay. In Rome, aqueducts collapsed, and cities emptied. In our time, collapsing bridges and brittle power grids echo that same neglect. Rome's grain dole fed the hungry while buying their silence. Today, modern welfare systems perform a similar balancing act. Vital, compassionate, but also political. When budgets shrink, or trust erodes, unrest brews. Stability isn't just about money. It's about making people feel seen, something both Rome and we still struggle to get right. Private wealth today moves faster than ever before, but it behaves much the same as it did in ancient times. The rich insulate, consolidate, and withdraw in times of uncertainty. During Rome's decline, the elite retreated into villas. Today, they retreat into gated estates, offshore accounts, and tax havens. Fortresses built not of stone, but of distance. The modern state, like ancient Rome, is built on debt. We call it investment, stimulus, leverage. Rome called it tribute, taxation, emergency minting. The words have changed. The pressure has not. And while debt can drive growth, it can also bury it. Rome learned that too late. Will we? The fragility of currency is no longer visible in tarnished coins. It now flashes in fluctuating exchange rates, digital charts, and market crashes. But behind those numbers is the same human response: fear, withdrawal, retreat. The collapse of value, whether in bronze or bytes, begins in the heart before it reaches the marketplace. Today's digital currencies promise revolution, but they also echo something old: a world where the state is no longer trusted to manage money. Bitcoin is not Rome's successor, it is its rebellion. It reminds us that money, in its essence, is a belief shaped into a symbol. When belief shifts, so does the economy. Institutions today are layered with policies, safeguards, and automation. But no matter how complex the structure, the foundation is trust. Rome lost its institutions not to violence, but to irrelevance. When citizens looked at their leaders and no longer believed in fairness, justice, or competence, the decay accelerated. We often think of corruption as a modern disease, but it bloomed in Rome like ivy through marble. Officials padded ledgers, inflated costs, and ignored laws they wrote themselves. What mattered was not the crime, but the normalization. When corruption becomes tradition, systems crumble from the inside. Today's empires, economic or political, don't raise banners or build temples. They build brands, skyscrapers, and global platforms. Yet they rely on the same idea: dominance by structure. Rome's strength wasn't just its army, it was the expectation that Rome would always be there. When that belief cracked, the structure followed. The middle class is often seen as the backbone of any economy. Rome once had one: landowners, traders, craftsmen. But as inequality widened, that class shrank. People were squeezed between rising taxes and falling incomes. We see similar trends today. A stretch so slow it becomes invisible until suddenly it snaps. The language of economic collapse may sound technical now. Quantitative easing, credit downgrades, recessionary cycles. But the experience feels ancient. It is the same quiet panic, the same empty shelves. The same resignation occurs when wages lose meaning and leaders lose answers. When citizens begin to rely more on each other than the state, a shift begins. In Rome, barter returned not as nostalgia, but as necessity. Today, we see versions of this in local currencies, mutual aid, and decentralized trade. These are not trends, they're signs. Signs that the official system is no longer meeting real needs. Rome's inability to adapt quickly was not just a flaw, it was a pattern. Decision-makers remained in denial, even as signs grew clearer. Today, data arrives faster, but responses are still delayed. Bureaucracy grows thicker. Courage shrinks. We're faster now, but are we any braver? As Rome began to fracture, people stopped looking to the capital for solutions. They turned inward, to towns, guilds, families, and faith. When the center grows distant, the periphery adapts. Today, we see this when local communities fill gaps the state no longer reaches. When trust falls from the top, people build sideways, not out of rebellion, but survival. Think of our endless subscriptions, our recurring fees, our taxed time, and our tracked lives. These aren't new. Rome once demanded annual census records, land tithes, and loyalty oaths. Today it's passwords, profiles, and income declarations. The system needs data to believe in you. If it doesn't see you, it doesn't serve you, or it forgets you entirely. Every financial crisis reveals the same human rhythm: denial, delay, collapse, repair. Rome moved through that cycle many times, but repair grew weaker with each loop. In our world, we cushion the crash with stimulus and policy, but often forget to reform. Rome teaches us that rescue without redesign only postpones the fall. Social contracts were the unseen glue of Roman life. The agreement that you paid taxes and obeyed laws, and Rome, in return, kept you safe and fed. When that contract failed, revolt followed. Today, when people lose faith in fairness, in public services, in access to opportunity, the contract frays again, silently but dangerously. Rome built monuments not just for gods, but to remind people they were part of something vast. Today, we build stadiums, screens, and mega projects. They symbolize pride, power, and permanence. But like Rome's arches and forums, they can also become hollow, admired from the outside, empty within. The Roman elite were insulated by wealth, but trapped by the same system they built. When the collapse came, even their villas weren't safe. In our time, wealth can buffer, but not always protect. If the economy around it burns, gold turns to kindling. No fortress lasts forever in a failing world. Politics in Rome drifted toward performance. Parades, titles, promises. The empire became a stage, and emperors played more roles than they ruled. Our media age often echoes this. Optics over action, spin over substance. Rome didn't fall because of a lack of ceremony. It fell because the ceremony replaced leadership. The Roman economy, at its end, became increasingly symbolic. Coins without silver, laws without force, offices without meaning. We risk something similar in a world flooded with content, data, and metrics, but short on depth. When everything is measured and nothing is believed, collapse becomes a mood long before it becomes a moment. Security in Rome was once public and funded by the state. As it eroded, the wealthy hired private guards. Today, we see similar shifts: private security, gated enclaves, and digital firewalls. When protection becomes personal, society starts dividing itself between the safe and the vulnerable, and no amount of walls can restore trust. Rome relied on provinces for resources. When those regions weakened or withdrew, the capital starved. In the global economy, supply chains function much the same. When the outer links snap, whether from war, disease, or economic pressure, even the most powerful centers falter. Citizenship in Rome once promised to belong. Later, it became a burden. People bribed their way out of it to escape taxes and duties. Today, citizenship still carries weight, but it's shifting. What was once a shield can become a chain, if it no longer guarantees dignity, fairness, or opportunity. Emperors once handed out food and coins to win affection. Today it's stimulus checks, grants, and tax breaks. These are not inherently wrong. They are tools. But if they replace long-term vision with short-term applause, the pattern returns. Temporary peace in exchange for permanent drift. Rome tried to legislate stability. It passed reforms, changed coinage, and redrew provinces. But it never changed how people felt, and feelings, trust, fear, hope are the true economy. Today, we track consumer confidence as a statistic, but it is the same ancient instinct. Belief in tomorrow shapes how we spend today. Technology today moves faster than any chariot ever dreamed. But pace isn't everything. Rome had aqueducts and roads, feats of engineering, but still collapsed beneath emotional and ethical decay. Progress without wisdom is motion without a map. That truth didn't vanish with the empire. There are lessons hidden in the ruins, not about conquest, but about consequences, not about Caesar, but about debt. It's not about victory, but about maintenance. Rome doesn't teach us how to rule. It teaches us how rulers lose sight, and how systems, if not nurtured, devour themselves. Many now ask, are we repeating Rome's mistakes? But maybe the better question is, do we recognize them when we make them? Rome did not believe it could fall. It believed systems were self-correcting. That belief was its greatest flaw, wrapped in pride and denial. The digital age has made us faster, richer, and more informed. But are we more grounded? Rome was connected too, by roads and laws and trade. What it lacked in wires, it made up in reach. And still, when the soul went missing, the structure followed. Today, the same risk floats quietly beneath our networks. Even as empires shift, the human longing for meaning remains. Rome gave it through citizenship, ritual, and structure. When those faded, new forms arose: religion, local rule, memory. In our time, when economies fail, people don't vanish, they reshape. The world doesn't stop, it reorganizes. The collapse of Rome was not a single moment, but a long forgetting of purpose, of balance, of who the system was meant to serve. That forgetting didn't come from malice, it came from distraction, from excess, from assuming tomorrow would look like yesterday. It never does. Rome is not behind us, it is beside us, in our banks, our policies, our assumptions. Its warning is not doom, but detail. It whispers, build, yes, innovate, always. But never forget that the heart of every system is not stone or software. It is trust, and trust must be earned, or everything else is borrowed time. Closing and reflection. So now, as we approach the end of our journey through the financial veins of ancient Rome, let us not close the book with a clang, but with a quiet turning of the page. We have walked through grandeur, decay, echoes, and mirrors. But what remains, truly remains, is not the ruins of marble or the faded coins in museum glass. What remains is the lesson, and it hums beneath our own world, softly, insistently. Rome was not just a place, it was a pattern, one written in stone, metal, and memory. It rose through discipline and order, through infrastructure and inclusion. It expanded by uniting people through shared rules and reliable systems. But it faltered not from a single invasion or one terrible ruler. It fell, slowly, under the weight of its own illusions. The currency that once carried the empire forward became its greatest vulnerability, not because it lost value in numbers, but because it lost value in meaning. Trust, once etched into every coin and sealed by every law, evaporated. And when trust disappears, systems collapse, not with fire, but with forgetting. Today, our world is brighter, faster, more complex. Our money flows invisibly through fiber optics and satellites. Our policies are drafted by data, and our commerce is driven by unseen code. But even now, especially now, we are not far from Rome. Not in our habits, not in our hopes. Rome teaches us that systems are only as strong as their soul. You can mint coins, write laws, and even conquer continents. But if the people stop believing in the fairness of the system, the honesty of its leaders, the worth of its currency, the balance of its justice, then the fall begins. Quietly, patiently. Let us pause here and remember the faces of those forgotten by history. The baker in Gaul could no longer sell bread for coin. The soldier on the frontier paid in promises. The craftsman whose tools outlived the worth of his wages. They did not topple an empire, but they lived its unraveling. And what of us? We still build systems. We still rely on invisible trust. We still ask our institutions to be fair, to give meaning to our work, value to our effort, and dignity to our place in the world. And when they falter, we do what Rome's citizens did. We turn inward, we hoard, we barter, we question. Perhaps we should. For Rome shows us not how to fall, but how falling begins, not in catastrophe, but in choices, not in war, but in avoidance. The empire did not ignore its problems, it rationalized them. It managed decline until decline managed everything. There were attempts to restore order, to remint the coin, to pass new laws, to fix what was clearly broken. But systems are like soil. Once exhausted, they take time to heal. And Rome did not wait. It improvised, it reacted, but it forgot to reflect. Reflection is not easy. It asks us to slow down, to admit fragility, to challenge the stories we tell about power and permanence. Rome stopped doing that. It assumed continuity. It mistook longevity for invincibility. And when the gap between symbol and substance grew too wide, the structure hollowed. You cannot hold an empire together with slogans. And yet, how often do we try? We say growth, innovation, and recovery, and hope the words become real. We launch reforms with confidence, even when the roots remain untouched. Rome did this too, again and again, and each time the effect wore thinner. The people grew quieter, not because they were content, but because they had stopped expecting change. Rome's decay was not loud, it was passive. It did not break under pressure. It drifted apart in silence. Silence, when it settles over a civilization, is far more dangerous than chaos, because silence conceals decay until the foundation has already given way. Look around our modern world. Are we so different? We have stronger tools, yes. Greater reach, yes. But also the same fragilities, the same temptations to stretch systems too far, to centralize too tightly, to spend more than we have, to assume trust will always be there, to govern more for optics than outcomes. Rome teaches us the danger of forgetting maintenance, not just of infrastructure, but of ideals. It's not enough to build. We must preserve. It's not enough to pass laws. We must live by them. It's not enough to tax. We must return value. Rome taxed until the people abandoned the system. They didn't revolt. They resigned. There is something haunting about resignation, about watching people disengage not because they're angry, but because they no longer believe. That is how empires end, not with explosions, but with withdrawal. And the most tragic part, Rome could have corrected the course. It had the knowledge, the talent, the memory of reform, but it had lost the habit of listening. So let us now listen to history, to silence, to those beneath the system. Let us ask, not how to remain powerful, but how to remain worthy of power. Let us learn from the grandeur, yes, but let us learn more from the fall, because the ruins are still speaking, not to scare us, to guide us. They whisper, we were like you. We had cities that glowed. We had systems that amazed us. We had pride. We had peace. And then we forgot. We forgot to adapt. We forgot to reform. We forgot that trust must be earned every day by everyone. And when trust died, so did we. So, as we dim the lights on this story and let its dust settle into our thoughts, carry this with you. Power is not proof of wisdom. Wealth is not proof of health. And systems, no matter how large, are only as strong as the honesty they uphold. Rome was not defeated. Rome decayed. Not by others, by itself. And that is the lesson. One last soft question before the night fully arrives. Are we listening? Or are we simply assuming, as Rome once did, that the future will wait for us to change? Because in the end, history does not punish. It reminds, quietly, again and again, until someone, finally, listens.